I
Can you
just
say
got
that
a
again?
notification. The FBI just arrested like a Wisconsin judge. I just get the notification on my glasses. It just pops up, and I'm like, "Oh, the world's ending." And I go, "Oh, back to
Do
the
you have
podcast."
like fancy glasses doing notifications there?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness. You're way too far ahead of us. Hello
I am
everyone. Good morning.
trying. I was gonna say
Good
I'm trying to
morning.
stay as far away from touching grass as possible.
It is Friday, April 25th at about 8:30 a.m. here on the West Coast. Costin Ryu is having dental surgery today, so shout out to Costin, all the very best to him with his dentist. We have a fill-in buddy today who is Mr. Thomas Rid, the professor of strategic studies and the founding director of the Alperovitch Institute. There's a long title that includes Johns Hopkins. Can you just fill in the audience and who you are and what you're up to lately?
I'm just professor at Johns Hopkins. I occasionally write books that people sometimes even read, and I'm very happy to be here and slightly nervous.
Look at him trying to be modest with his nervousness. What does a professor at Johns Hopkins do?
Oh, we teach and then are expected to write articles and books when we don't teach. And yesterday was the last day of teaching, so I'm now fully back to writing.
As awesome. A pretend professor at Johns Hopkins, this is the most guidance I've gotten about the work we're supposed to be doing. So I appreciate you asking. And
that's it. It's very transparent.
Good morning, Juanito. How are you, buddy?
Good, man. I'm happy we got Thomas in here. We actually had a really lovely hangout yesterday at Thomas's place with Max Smeets, who's visiting. Did a guest lecture and sort of promoting his new book, Ransomware, which I'm actually pretty excited to read after all of the build up. Like, he was our keynote at LabsCon this year, so just nice to see friends and folks come over here. I even saw Brandon Levine, whom I see less often than I see Max Smeets, despite him living in Switzerland.
Are you guys now part of the whole DC dinner party culture thingy? Is that
it's the new Georgetown set. It's just people talking AI, like on fire pits and stuff.
Yeah, we have to add that there are approximately 7 days in the year where you can actually sit outside in a pleasant environment in DC. So we caught one of those 7 days.
I'm avoiding the other 6.
Speaking of AI. Can we start right there? I want to start right there because Thomas, I mean, we've raved. You're listening to the show. We've raved in the past about AI. Juanito is our resident AI shill and AI expert. We got a big notice out of Anthropic today that they're researching AI welfare. They're beginning to approximate, as they're building AI systems, the argument is they're approximating or surpassing many human qualities. And the other question that arises is, should we be more concerned about the potential consciousness and experiences of the models themselves? Do these AI systems deserve moral consideration? Should we look for signs of distress and low-cost interventions for these AI models? Last week, Juanito told us that our math was completely wrong with how the universe is being described. And now I'm hearing that math has feelings.
Costin said that. I don't know shit about math, okay? Let's be clear here.
But math has feelings here, Juanito. What do you make of this as the resident AI guy?
Don't start with me. Start with Thomas. Honestly, don't start with me because I already was tweeting memes about Anthropic researchers worrying about the feelings of waifu pillows. So maybe start with somebody a little more reasonable.
Interesting thing to you, Thomas, or you dismiss it? You dismiss this as hooey-fooey nonsense, or are they onto something?
Obviously, if we look at the bigger arch and history of AI research, going all the way back to the 40s, really, there have always been these two themes. On the one hand, the urge, very deep human urge to play God, to create, to make a machine that is perhaps better than we are, literally more intelligent than we are. That was part of the very early motivation. And there's also this other frame that we want to build machines who help us build better tools. And I think we see both playing out today, sometimes in the same companies, and really in the same minds and the same people. And the thing that I find fascinating here is that, you now see this influx, these people, philosophers, joining AI labs in order to talk about machines acquiring potentially rights and consciousness. So there's a market, the whole debate that is incentivized financially as well, because they get very well paid and very dynamic young individuals. So yes, of course, when you introduce that question, will the machines acquire consciousness? To me, the obvious conclusion is, well, it will be very hard to prove, but there will be people who at some point will seriously argue that that is going to be the case. And there will be others who make fun of them, who argue the other side. But that debate is going to be bigger and growing as we move forward, I think. So that is just an observation of fact, in my view. Then, of course, the question is, where do we put ourselves on that spectrum, on that debate? And there it gets more interesting and perhaps a little more spicy. And that's maybe a nice segue to what Juan has to say about this.
Juan has been rolling his eyes all the way.
All I'm saying is, like, this discussion has been had for like 60 fucking years, and none of these kids are like inventing any of this stuff. Like,
For those just listening, Juanito held up 3 very thick books.
I'm pulling books out because like this was my undergraduate thesis, and it wasn't any fucking like cuter then. It was just, we were in the middle of an AI winter, so it was not hard to accept that, you know, the philosophical foundations of AI or of strong AI are weak. Because at the time you're like, well, none of it worked anyway. So yes, absolutely. So when I did my undergraduate thesis, it was considered, like I've said before, it was some hipster bullshit to do. Now it just makes me feel like I'm exceedingly prepared for this argument. But I think Thomas brought up, as a native academic, you brought up the true mechanism, I think, of what's happening here. And I'm ashamed to say it's something that's happened with academic philosophy several times now over the past 80 years or so, which is the humanities are hard to fund. Philosophy may be the least practical of the humanities. And what you get is this kind of like pragmatic betrayal of philosophy that happens every like 30, 40 years, where you go, you know what, it's really hard to fund this shit, but what are people funding right now? Statistics and like scientific research. Well, what if like philosophy became this like pseudoscientific formalistic thing? And that's what you get with like Timothy Williamson and like selling out all of Oxford's philosophy department for like 50, 60 years to become like pseudoscientific so that they could raise funds and like have a much nicer time in doing philosophy. And I think we're seeing something really similar happening with AI. I don't want to paint it all so poorly, because I do think that we need philosophers, that we need people thinking about morality and thinking about ethics involved in this conversation, especially in the bleeding edge of something so difficult to grok. However, the idea that we're getting philosophers and folks to have influence inside of these places, and they're spending it in this like obviously patently ridiculous anthropomorphized bullshit, is insane. It's sad. Like,
why do you call it that? I mean, you give me this big, giant, long preamble that it's important to get these folks involved. Thomas talked about, like, you know, the importance of new voices and new thoughts coming into it, and then you dismiss it as ultimate bullshit. Like,
because it's ridiculous to the point of satire, to place importance on the possibility of AI welfare while completely ignoring the actuality of human welfare, right? Like we're willing to discuss the science fiction scenario in narrow terms of like, what if we harm the models? And you go, but what about all the people you're actually harming?
I mean, that's one aspect, and of course there must not be, you know, the distraction argument has its limits, because we can process multiple problems at the same time, I think.
That's fair.
And that's an argument that sometimes is made in this conversation by some AI people. But it seems to me that if you look at that long historical arch that we both, I think are a little bit familiar with here, of the anthropomorphizing, talking about the machines through the lens of the human mind, which is, you know, for example, was a key thing that motivated Marvin Minsky, one of the, you know, pioneers in this space, and many others, even John von Neumann before him, even Turing. But the point here is, oftentimes we slid into a philosophical conversation, and sometimes with very little focus on cognitive sciences and biology even. But what is missing from this conversation, almost completely missing to this day, is politics. And what I mean by that is, imagine just for a moment that within the next couple of years, and this is very realistic as a prediction, one of the AI labs, perhaps Anthropic, because they seem most interested in that kind of philosophical debate, will say, okay, now we have developed a model that has acquired some form of consciousness, that maybe has a certain moral personhood, moral rights. We can't no longer just switch it off because it feels real feelings. And then at some point, I'll take it a little further just to push this to its extreme, this situation. Perhaps even they embody that thing, that model in some form of robotic embodiment, give it some sort of awareness of the world, some sensory input and understanding of physics, how things move around, approximate sort of human looks. It doesn't have to be perfect, but, do some form of machine that is beginning to interact with the environment that they claim has consciousness and rights. Now, by definition, that will happen at a time when the labor market across all the sectors, most sectors, has been affected dramatically by artificial intelligence already. And they will have formed very significant resistance, political resistance against these tools, against these companies, against this technology. It's already beginning. You've heard talk of techno-feudalism and techno-fascism coming from the far left and the far right. So can we really imagine that some lab with, some out-of-control philosophers is declaring consciousness, conscious robots with rights, and that normal people will think, oh, yeah, of course, they have a good point. These machines should have rights. Absolutely. I'm in favor of that. That to me is just completely naive. And of course, there will be conflict and friction. The only question is how intense that conflict will be about that future of the machines that will be created in some form.
I think look, you're hitting on the right points, especially like in how we view the motivations of some of this philosophizing. To like not get so it's not a social problem in my view. The idea of like anthropomorphizing these things and discussing them on moral terms. I think that's where what you see is actually the problem with a bunch of people who are very proud of dropping out of college, deciding that they're going to weigh in on like sort of humanistic concerns and go into sort of this kind of philosophizing, which is that it really betrays how weak an understanding people can have of things like morality, like the premise of morality being one of harm reduction, and in some ways very much related to our mortality, right? You're talking about things that are defined in relation to human beings as human beings. You don't want to harm folks. We acknowledge that you can't just like pause a human being and restart them. You don't get to change their state and take them back to a place where you have not harmed them. But none of that is true of these models, right? Like the part where this gets so ridiculous is it's anthropomorphic to a point of like assigning our existential condition to a fucking calculator. And that's where, and like to say, how will the calculator feel about its batteries running out? And you go, well, I think you're basically saying we are going to make the smartest machines and imbue them with our weakest and lowest qualities, and that's how we should think about them, and we should be really worried about it. Are we doing wrong by the model? Get the fuck out of here.
Completely. I can't not see the irony if you holding a cat as you say this, because obviously the intellectual capabilities of the existing models are way ahead of most animals and some humans.
Are we doing right by you?
But
is there ever going to be scientific consensus on any of this, or this will just be
for sure.
academic?
Depends on where the money is. Like philosophy, I think the issue with philosophy is that you will find people who are willing to philosophize indefinitely, and there's no such thing as clearing up a problem. But that all gets very, very real when the price of coffee goes up, and when people are unwilling to pay for us to like play salon. And that's actually why I'm annoyed at philosophers having the opportunity to enter the mainstream in a well-paid, respected manner with the titles of frontier labs attached to their names and doing something this fucking obnoxiously caricaturesque. Because look, I don't have a problem with them discussing this as well, right? Like Thomas, you said we can think of multiple things, right? Like we're not, so our bandwidth is not so limited that we can only tackle one problem at a time. But the other more obviously important argument shines by its absence. Like, where are the panels and where's David Chalmers on, you know, the health of the human mind or human society in the face of AI models and the effects that they're having in an equal or hopefully greater importance than having this whole hullabaloo about whether the AI has rights. Like, that's where it feels ridiculous to me.
And you drop David Chalmers' names. That's the guy. That's the researcher referenced by Anthropic in this thing, and they have a PDF, a research report out that I'll put into the show notes here that argue that there's a realistic possibility that some AI systems will be conscious and or robustly agentic in the near future. Do you guys understand what that means? Like, what is the
I'm letting Thomas, because we keep running over Thomas trying to speak. I go for it, Thomas, please.
No. I mean, it's fine. The robustly agentic piece is a bit confusing because it could mean so many different things here. But I think what they mean is that it will have its own, that it will act as its own agent, presumably in some form of embodied way. The next usual conversation in this context is the question of embodiment. Will the agents exist only as VMs, like essentially as simulated bodies, or will they actually have a body? But I'll take it one step further. And that is, you know, imagine, again, it's really important to appreciate we are looking at a bunch of people who are trying to replicate the human condition inside machines. That is their whole goal. So to an extent, they will succeed in doing that because it's pretty impressive what they have achieved so far. But then even if you give the machine a body, even if you give it a fear and feelings that it can articulate, the question, even if you give it an instinct to try to survive, to avoid getting switched off, for example. I mean, we're talking science fiction here, but
this is the runaway thing that the layman is scared of, right? The runaway AI that is not capable of being turned off.
Yeah, but the point is, even when you have philosophers working for or adjacent to or funded by AI labs, claiming that some of this stuff is now a reality, it will be extremely controversial. Is it real when a machine tries to avoid getting switched off? Is the feeling of like mortal fear the same kind of mortal fear that biological organisms feel, humans and others too? And that is not a question where you will get consensus on ever. That I think is the fundamental. There may be a debate. Is it technically possible? Yes or no? That's okay. But here, the political baseline observation, it will be impossible to agree on the outcome of that debate. That I think is even more fundamental and more important.
Where does this take us, Juanito?
Well,
are we just arguing over a research paper that Anthropic wanted to fund and put out a press release and they've moved on, or we think this is something serious?
I wish it were that cynical. I wish we could be that cynical. I'm actually concerned at how not cynical this seems, which to me means that one of the frontier labs, one of the leading AI training cartels is so deluded in its own vision of what they're doing that they cannot distinguish this kind of philosophizing and navel gazing from genuine strategy. And I say that because this is a criticism I've had of Anthropic before I read this, ridiculous paper and sat through the more ridiculous Chalmers paper that they pointed to, which is that, I mean, Anthropic is not keeping up with the other ones. Like, people are extremely impressed by Claude's ability to code, and that's what you will always hear. Claude is amazing at coding. Claude is amazing at coding, and you go, that's cool, bro. But like, we've had LLMs specifically for coding to some greater or lesser extent since before we had ChatGPT, right? Like, sort of Codex and these things coming out early on. And now we've moved on to discussions about like how these things search the internet, how they help in doing deep research, how they help in sort of literature reviews and condensing information, and you know, you're talking about all these different applications, and Anthropic is not keeping up at all. They seem to refuse to want to connect this thing to the internet, and you could make the argument that that is some kind of like sort of technical, artistic, purist choice. But I think from a consumer standpoint, I think it reflects almost like this fear they have of the thing that they're building. And that's where I think the philosophizing has, like, you've clearly sort of poisoned the well inside of Anthropic if you are making strategic product decisions at a frontier lab, of which there are not that many companies that can just go burn $10 million or however much training a fucking model, much less one that you're worried like, oh, you know, we need to make it as safe as possible because we need to make sure the alignment problem is not an issue. You're like, dude, this fucking thing can barely like search the internet and keep track of states of links. The fuck are you talking about alignment? We can barely get it to consistently use a tool, you know? And again, this also goes back to another kind of bizarre overextended delusion of the San Francisco cabal, which is this notion of like orders of magnitude and like the inevitability of these things reaching escape velocity, right? Like, we're not talking about we're not talking about like the capabilities and the problems of today's AI. We're talking about the AI of 6 months from now, which takes some insane, you know, hyperspeed curve in development and all of a sudden starts to think and breathe and control all of humanity. You're like, God, the fuck?
You know, I mean, I know from teaching, for example, I just wrapped up my digital counterintelligence class, which was more, you know, traditional, so to speak, in terms of cyber operations and whatnot. But occasionally we have been dipping into the AI debate, and students, this was a very good group of students, are just fascinated with this and somewhat intimidated by the trend lines that we're seeing as well. You know, we all question our own value proposition occasionally when we are so impressed by the output of these machines. So why am I saying this? Well, Anthropic has done some extraordinary research, for example, on feature extraction. If you Google monosemanticity, that's, I don't know, maybe a little more than a year ago at this stage. So they find that the models are able to abstract features, or more, it's effectively abstractions of concepts. The Golden Gate Bridge and sycophancy were two such features that got a lot of press. And of course, at some point they will possibly, if they haven't done so already, extract a feature and find it somewhere in that abstract vector space of, you know, fear, maybe the wish to survive, maybe some form of consciousness or things that are related to consciousness. But then, of course, the next question is, okay, then we have those two mindsets will reassert themselves. You will have some people, and we, all three of us, probably fall into that group, who say, well, cool, these concepts actually make the tool more powerful, better coding, better responses to abstract, all sorts of questions. And the other camp will say, oh, those features now show that we have created something that actually feels feelings and actually, you know, has consciousness. And the point is, we will, for the foreseeable future, have that debate very fiercely. And I think it will get much more unpleasant down the line as the disagreements sharpen.
And the politics set in. But what's wrong with doing this early? What's wrong with a company saying, you know what, let's think about this very, very early? And I bring this up because we have Sam Altman, the other member of the cabal here, that says AI privacy safeguards can't be established before problems emerge. Basically saying, yeah, it's a little too early to think about the privacy implications because the real problem cases haven't emerged yet.
Look at the bait and switch. You're talking about privacy. Like this is what I was talking about earlier on, where like when it comes to to these broader discussions, like I think Sam Altman is a much more like adept operator and I just think he's like a smarter leader in some of this, and there's more thought out strategy there. And I don't want to be super cynical about what Sam Altman says all the time, but this is where you see the interest in a much more naked fashion of like, let's not burden our development with privacy stuff right now unnecessarily. And
how does that always end?
Well, to be fair to Sam Altman, this is also an anthropomorphized concern in the sense of we were doing all of the like. Look, I had an internal argument with someone at the company about like, well, should we enable Gemini for everyone in the company? Like, what about the data risks? And you go, everyone in the company gets Gemini because everyone in the company has G Suite, and they've already been putting all their fucking company
the documents are in Google Docs
Google Drive.
Anyway.
Like they're already so like whatever problem, why and I ask this for like a human perspective. We are suddenly having conversations about privacy concerns that we already gave up, and we were willing to not give a fuck 10 years ago. We were willing to like when honestly like Gmail is probably the breaking sort of the Rubicon moment, which is when my 14-year-old self included, like we all just said, yeah, you don't really need to like self-host your email, even though before it was like, those are my private communications, like what server, whatever is it going to? And that just kind of was the slippery slope of the convenience of like, well, then let's put everything in Google Drive. And like, wow, I marvel at people who still use like Microsoft Word to edit documents with other people. How fucking archaic. Google Docs is such a convenient way to collaborate. And now like most companies have some mega cloud deployment of all their stuff. And it's really interesting when you consider that like that includes people who compete with Google. The reason I'm bringing this all up is the ludicrousness of handing your information and handing basically like the scaffolding of all of your institutional knowledge to a competitor and to an external company was decided a little less than a decade ago. And only now are we having these conversations in a public, meaningful way because you've put an anthropomorphic layer over it, where it's like, well, now it talks like a person talks. So should we really be telling the thing that talks all sorts of stuff about us? And you go, the thing that talks runs on the same fucking servers you already put all your bullshit into. And all that's keeping them from training these machines on that is like a flimsy piece of paper that's like, just a EULA and maybe some enterprise legal agreements. And nobody gives a shit about the EULA. They'll rewrite that on the back of a napkin. But like the enterprise agreements only matter because that also means that you have a lawyer on the other side, so there may be some implied risk. But practically, like we gave up the plot.
It's also maybe just worth restating, because the numbers are so awesome, that I think the most recent OpenAI figures that we have are 500 million active weekly, not monthly, but active weekly users. And of course, on top of that are the users who use other models that are, widely used, Gemini, Claude, and whatever. There's a bunch of them out there.
Whatever happened to the Chinese thing that everyone was scared of?
DeepSeek?
Yeah.
Do we have user figures for that? I'm not familiar.
I don't know. I haven't seen any user figures, but we did an entire episode on this being an existential crisis for AI in the US, and that suddenly kind of went where we talked about banning it, and we just talk about banning it, and we'll get a TP link in it because I want to connect all of these as well, but finish up your thought, Tom.
But think about the amount of data that people copy, paste, or type into the context window, obviously in the browser as well as in the APIs, through the APIs. I mean, must be an awe-inspiring amount of information. A lot of it, just because the output is so helpful, we have to assume IP that is, proprietary,
100%.
Because people don't really think about the implications of giving that to Anthropic. Which has fascinating implications here.
When we go to RSA next week and we walk the show floor, you'll see a whole billions of dollars of VC funded companies driving the same kind of DLP for AI and rights management about who gets to see what and who gets to place what into context windows, because I think that's a bigger risk. OpenAI and these big vendors publicly talk about how they track APTs and threat actors using ChatGPT to do scripting and coding and to clean up things. So they can and have access to exactly what you're doing to it. And the idea that we're just pasting all of this IP into these windows are just insane.
Look, I want to have like a more sophisticated conversation about this. Like I'm annoyed at the level of sort of philosophizing and moralizing around this again, because it's like so fucking naive and just leaving meaningful, important questions on the table. So let's just try to raise the profile of conversation by just a smidge. Instead of thinking about this as some kind of like human soul that we have embodied in some machine, even if we put it in some kind of robot, which, again, putting something in a body or a body equivalent does not make it human equivalent. It does not create the same sense of mortality, replaceability, authenticity that comes with being a human being. Thank God. Frankly, those are pretty terrifying and awful things. There's a reason that life is painful at its core and genuinely so, like, existentially dreadful. We look for meaning and purpose because our lives are limited. We're going to die. If it weren't for that, authenticity would not be a human priority. You would just say, well, I have 1,000 years to do whatever the fuck I intend to do, so why does it matter right now? That is never going to happen to an embodied whatever the fuck AI. So let's talk about something on more realistic terms. Instead of the Skynet version of AI, let's go with the what Thomas talked about as like this mentality around like making these like the centaur model, right? Like this enhanced human, this super intelligence as the intelligent human being assisted by an intelligent expert system that sort of magnifies our capabilities, which I think is a much more realistic and frankly valuable assessment than trying to write ourselves out of an existence by replacing ourselves with like fucking robots. So if we look at it in that sense, where I think it's a much more sober view of AI innovation as increases in evaluative power coming from a dual source, a second source, an artificial source. For the first time in human life, evaluative power is not only constrained to human beings, incredibly inefficient machines. Let's talk about the national security implications of that. Like I had a really interesting conversation about this at our AI sommelier society meeting last week, I won't call out the person, but Joel, in all your brilliance, we were discussing national security implications of some of these things, and frankly, there's something really interesting to be discussed. To some degree, we rely the strategic chessboard of the nation state sort of geopolitical landscape relies on a certain amount of intelligence, of limitation and intelligence distribution. A country has only so much intellectual capital around, and it can only and it cannot produce it out of thin air right now, right? Like if India wants to increase its capabilities in like nuclear fission or whatever, they cannot just spawn 1,000 PhDs that are somehow capable and have the intellectual capability, the tribal knowledge, et cetera, to be really good at this thing. And to some degree, like that places a certain cap and limitation on what we can expect from certain countries. So we start to see models like O1, O1 Pro, O3, which are like genuinely fascinatingly capable in specialized reasoning. They're genuinely valuable. They're actually helpful. And I ask you the national security implications when, let's say, OpenAI moves to O5, right? Like this thing is just brilliant. It's creating like protein equivalents. Like OpenAI has funded itself by creating a cheap protein equivalent of Viagra that they patent themselves for the next 40 years. And that's how they're going to pay for their insane $20 billion a year runway. O3 doesn't look quite as valuable anymore. India comes in and goes, oh, Sam, we will pay you $20 billion or $10 billion for the rights to O3. Like just to host it and be able to run it and spawn it in whatever capacity we want. As the US government, how do you handle a frontier lab that is about to hand over the ability to increase the intelligence density of another nation? Those are interesting questions. Those are ethically and morally interesting discussions to be had. And that is not reliant on some scaling law, magical thinking bullshit about how Skynet is about to change the human condition. That is just realistic and pragmatic on the basis of what's already here. And those are the fucking discussions that I want to be having as a philosopher at a frontier lab. Yeah.
Thomas, what's wrong with doing this early? Just to close the loop on this story. We were going for 30 minutes on AI's consciousness. It's starting to.
I know. It's an issue.
What's wrong with examining this pretty early in the game rather than waiting for 5 years and 05 with consciousness, and then we said, why didn't we have some philosophers think about this? Like, this is pretty important work.
I mean, I'm not dismissing it out of hand entirely. I'm more interested in it as a historian. I mean, there's no question right now that we're living through one of the most extraordinary moments in terms of technology history in our lifetime. And this is
you equate this with like the creation of the internet?
Oh, completely. I mean, we have the creation of the internet. We have the touch screen, I think, was a huge milestone. And there's no question we're looking at something on that scale and possibly bigger right now. But we're in the middle of that trend, that moment, so it's very difficult to assess it. And of course, there's value in thinking about extreme scenarios and discussing some of those philosophical questions. But I think I would rather want to do it in an informed, sober, realistic way that also takes into account, like, take the national security political conversation. I listen to and read a lot of this AI conversation right now, and often the model of politics that you get, for example, in the AI 2027 forecast, is arms race with China. That's like the extent to the political thinking that you encounter. Arms race with China will be bad. What should we do about it? Is already bad. But I mean, the more interesting questions are really domestic. What is this going to do to labor, to how we think about work? How should we change the education of our kids and of our students as a result? How do we make sure that the value add that we bring to the table, doesn't matter whether you're a developer, an author, or working with your hands, how do you maximize the value add, and how do you maximize the value add in terms of its resistance to AI innovation over time? These are far more important hands-on questions, like, what should I recommend my kids to study and to focus on in terms of their hobbies and core skills down the line? We're not really having that conversation. Instead, we're having a conversation in the AI circles, I will add, more about these somewhat misguided and really they're vain, juvenile questions about playing God. That there's no coincidence. I'm sorry, I'm being a little sharp here and pointy, but in my view,
sorry for being sharp and pointy, please.
But it's no coincidence that usually the people making these bold statements are, very, like, they work at desks all day long, and often they work in a quite technical context all day long. And oftentimes, and of course there are exceptions, but often they're quite young, they don't have kids. Their perspective is just so limited and naive, making assumptions about scaling in a robotics context, for example, that just strike me as, and I do a lot of work with my hands. I grew up in a very blue collar environment, thinking you can automate some, the other day, one of my students who I really respect, he's one of my brightest students, predicted confidently that in 5 years, I will no longer have, a plumber come install my sump pump, but rather a robot will show up at my door.
In 5 years? That's pretty aggressive.
Yeah, we don't teach people about supply chain complexities. I love the way that you're framing it, Thomas. I also think that it's funny to say that you think to describe that as being sharp or pointy. when you've so carefully kept yourself from calling them autists, right? Like there's this like autistic, and I say that coming, from within the tribe, right? Like there's this autistic disconnect with reality, and I think that's why
negative connotation of what autism is. I mean, you're going to get blowback for that statement.
Look,
I get the tone you're. Yeah.
I appreciate, I understand it, and I'm being super flippant.
Fact checking you in real life.
Ryan,
yes.
like I'm being flippant from the perspective of someone on the spectrum. But what I really mean by that is as a shorthand for what Thomas is saying, which is like, look, guys, like I don't leave my house. What the fuck do I know about what manufacturing looks like and what the complexities of that are? What do I understand about what it's really going to take to replace a plumber? And more importantly, like, why is that something so desirable? Like there's this almost like sense of objection we discussed it here before. It's like this need to assert human dominance in microaggressions. Like we kind of hate the fact that like we are dependent on ourselves and yet feel relieved that we have not yet been replaced. And I think that brings in this like very strange psychology and psychological dread and complexity that we're feeling as human beings in seeing something arise that seems to mirror our humanity while also making it cheap, commoditized, readily accessible, and replaceable at a time when like human value feels like it's exceedingly low.
Yeah, I mean, I would urge, and maybe we can. I'll share. We have to move on from this at some point, but I would urge.
Surely.
Just as a final quick observation, if I may, I mean, I would urge people to read more history on the forecast of what the technology of, like, not in 20 years, but very soon in below 5-year time frame will look like, because you see the pattern repeat itself all the time. People are extremely bullish on predictions that then will not come to pass, and then do the very human thing of dismissing all the predictions that were wrong in the past as saying, oh, but they didn't have the technology that we have today, so of course they got it wrong, while we now will get it right.
We did what? Let me see. We did 42 minutes of AI's consciousness.
Sorry.
Now
you put it up there at the first.
We'll pivot to a cybersecurity story for the first time, but I don't even know if this is a cybersecurity story. I want us to address TP-Link. It's not something that popped up on the podcast, but there's been a slow mill of reporting of TP-Link getting the Kaspersky treatment, if you want to call it that. Bloomberg had some pretty solid reporting on TP-Link's geopolitical troubles, the fact that the company was founded in China by two brothers and then they were kind of estranged. One brother moved to the United States and tried to create it as a US company. But what Bloomberg found is that much of the research, development, manufacturing operations of this new US company remain in China. And it remained in China with a specific company that does massive research, development, manufacturing arm that has attracted Chinese government support. I say that TP-Link is getting the Kaspersky treatment because there are investigations happening, DOJ, Commerce departments looking at, national security implications of having this most dominant router. I mean, if you go to Amazon and you type router, TP-Link pops up. It's like the most dominant router here. And there's new reporting that the DOJ is examining whether the company engaged in predatory pricing because their routers are so cheap and pervasive throughout time. TP-Link has actually hired local US lobbyists. I know this because they've been lobbying me to talk about all this, the fact that they're not Chinese. How is this being played in DC circles? Is this something that's top of mind getting the Kaspersky treatment, or it's just more anti-China fear noise? Anyone?
I'm letting Thomas go, so I don't know, man. Like, this is what you get. You get the skewed. Like, you asked why we spent 42 minutes on AI and why Ryan put it at the top. He's just harvesting rants out of me until I get canceled. So,
I mean, please, that's why Thomas. I listen to this podcast.
What do you make of TP-Link, Thomas? And their geopolitical troubles.
I mean, the reporting that Bloomberg did, I agree, is very impressive to see. look at their supply chain and the continued links that they have in China, and in a way unsurprising that China continues to play a key role in manufacturing their
company
products.
has 11,000 people. That's surprising to me. I thought TP-Link would have been, 200 people in an office in the US just selling these cheap things. What are you doing with 11,000 people?
Well,
anyway,
you're forgetting the complexity there, right? Like you need 11,000 people to build hardware, right? Like that, and that's where it's interesting to see this sort of like divestiture model when it comes like the differences between hardware and software companies. We can call them all tech, but it's night and day, right? Like in this podcast, I am sure I have yelled and officially ranted about companies that didn't leave Russia, for example, when they saw, shit starting to hit the fan and they saw it all telegraphed, right? And we always say this about Kaspersky, but it also like look at what happened with Group IB and there's always this, and Yandex, right? Like Yandex sort of like pulling everyone out, like off the ground and getting the fuck out of Russia. And there's almost a similar expectation or playbook being played out by TP-Link, but it's a hardware company, and you don't just get to teleport 2,000 engineers out of China and say, there, we're good, right? Even that was like in itself is still a move that will continue to invite suspicion. Like just because you've relocated all these people does not mean that they're suddenly aligned, right? The models, but you have this very real, not subject to navel gazing concern, which is, well, how do you move manufacturing and an actual set of manufacturing plants and a whole process that goes into building those cheap routers and keep them cheap, which is what makes them attractive. Because just TP-Link deciding that they're going to rehome themselves in, Vietnam does not mean that they continue to have the dominance and sort of cheap supply that they did before. So like it's an interesting problem to consider when you talk about a hardware company, and it's still, if you ask for like a DC view on it, I think it's a gamble, similar to what we saw with what was it, ZTE? Like what was the other company that was like Huawei adjacent? It wasn't Huawei, but like it got so problematized that like I'm having a hard time even recalling their 3-letter acronym name. But it was a similar play of like, let's do some aggressive lobbying within the US and sort of get the same things sort of rolling, and somehow we're going to convince and lobby our way into non-Chinese hood.
I mean, it's also worth just spelling out the implicit assumptions that I think a lot of people here appear to be making in DC, and that is one of the rare non-partisan issues. The assumptions are that what we're looking at here, now in the case of TP-Link, but also sometimes other companies, is here, pricing, undercutting prices is potentially a covert ops vector. They just want to get as many devices out there as possible, have Americans buy them, and then effectively create a router fleet in waiting as a passive SIGINT platform.
Not a stretch to imagine, not a stretch at all, right? I mean, this is a realistic thing that could be in place. I mean, pricing as a covert ops vector.
Yeah, of course, it could be. I'm not saying it's unrealistic. All I'm saying is it's often not spelled out as clearly as this. And so far, we haven't seen the evidence of it actually happening. It's a bit of a future scenario. Not unrealistic, it's quite plausible. I'm not saying dismiss this as a threat, but it's important to be clear that we haven't actually seen that thing come to pass. And of course, we may say we don't want to have it come to pass ever. But the thing that I'm trying to point out here is what we're saying is don't trust this technology that can be updated because it's made in China or sold by a company with links to China and a supply chain in China. So distrust China. And of course, I'm not saying this is in principle a problem. There may be good reasons for doing so, but we should be clear about the implications, especially in a world where a lot of people look at the United States as a country that is no longer as trustworthy as it once was. And I mean, we just had a long conversation about AI, and almost all the leading products are American products here that are used globally.
I mean, that's a European deficiency, right? Like, sorry, Thomas, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I mean, of course it is not just a European deficiency. Also, other countries are struggling to keep up, and that's for a reason. The US is just by far the most dynamic market, has the most dynamic cluster of companies in Northern California here, mostly. But the fact remains, like, we're looking at this national distrust paradigm spreading in tech more and more, and it's very concerning because where does it lead us?
Thomas, your microphone has gotten a kind of a little bit of a boomy sound that suddenly started.
Because I got excited?
No, I think it was there from before when you, and maybe just from you raising the gain, but it's like a slight echo. Like sometimes in some of the bassier parts of your voice, it's almost like reverberating a little bit.
Okay.
And I'm leaving this all in the podcast. I'm not even going to edit this out of the podcast. So.
Okay.
You should
lower the gain just a little bit.
Yeah.
Juan, the signs here, though, the signs with this TP-Link story is quite obviously clear that they're heading towards being banned in the United States. The problem becomes you can't really get rid of these devices out of people's homes, right? You're going to live in people's home forever. We've talked ad nauseum about the fact that they never get updated. Like, we're heading to a place where we're trying to kick the TP-Link out of the United States, but we're going to be absorbing a long tail of pain and hurt and suffering. We've seen a lot of public documentation of nation-state APTs, Chinese specifically, using these home Soho routers, end-of-life routers. Our friends at Lumen speak constantly about this. So there is a nation-state implication at the time when the typhoons are going crazy in our telcos. Where is this all heading? I'm trying to understand, where does this whole TP-Link head? And more specifically, with millions and millions of these devices sprinkled out throughout the country, like, how do you mitigate this going forward?
So I think you're bringing it closer to my genuine area of concern here, which is like, I'm not worried that I'm not super concerned about where the routers come from specifically. I actually think when this first started, I was very dismissive. And I continue to be to some degree, not because I trust TP-Link, but rather like, I think it's always short-sighted to point out the problems with a whole swath of supply for something that people buy for extended periods of time, and not create a viable alternative, not point to an authoritative area of basically, like, look, let's be plain spoken. You're telling me to throw away my fucking TP-Link router and spend some money. What am I spending money on? Like, yeah, what the fuck am I buying? And frankly, and I've said this before, it's like, you only get one bullet, right? Like, you are not going to convince people to keep falling down the rungs buying increasingly expensive pieces of hardware that do the same thing your router was already doing. And like, most of these people, most people have routers that are provided by like their ISP in the
your
first
telco
place.
gives it
So
to you
like,
for free, or you lease it,
Well, like, so part of the thing here is like, why are we making this like a consumer level problem?
Well, these orb networks are
well, I mean, they're not, right? Like, the orb networks are our problem, right? Like, the home grade folks who like have these shitty Soho routers don't even know that they're a part of a botnet, and that's, I guess that speaks more to like bandwidth, right, these days, right? If this was happening in the DSL days and somebody was taking half of, like, everyone would have fucking be bothered by it, which is what was happening with botnets, which is it's the same thing, right? It's the exact same thing. It's just the botnets are now being used by, a nation state level threat, but it's the same shit. What I will also say, I think on a more, where I would like to see some sophistication enter the conversation. We have a new admin, like, new administration. There are some really smart people in the NSC doing cyber. I am not ready to say that they're gonna fuck this up and follow the same playbook that we followed with Kaspersky or whomever else, which is kind of this like half-hearted, bullshitty, like, oh, don't play with them kind of mentality. Because there's other features, there's other ways to tackle this problem that I think are much more interesting, more along the lines of like requirements towards inspectability, and like that's an issue that is more important. It's more it gives us much more of a choice and capability in handling this issue, and it's more universal. It's not a TP. That is not a TP-Link problem. That's a TP-Link problem, a Cisco problem, a Fortinet problem, an Ivanti problem, an iPhone Apple problem. Like it's a problem across the board. It's a consumer protection that we have failed to properly bring to the surface, which is I paid for this fucking hardware. It lives in my house. I should be able to tell what it's doing, why it's doing it, and on behalf of whom it's doing it. And I say that like with actually something very particular in mind. Like when I was coming back from Singapore, I bought, just out of like excitement and whatever, I bought an Oppo Find N5 folding Android phone.
You showed it on the podcast last week.
It's a beautiful piece of hardware. Absolutely magnificent piece of hardware. It is it is the same thickness as my iPhone, and it folds out to a screen bigger than an iPad mini. It is
good display.
Absolutely beautiful display, camera better than my iPhone, 4 lenses, like Hasselblad, whatever, post finishing, like phenomenal piece of hardware. I haven't used it at all, because it turns out Oppo, which is the Chinese version,
Android
like the owner of,
right?
Well, yeah, but they're the owners of like OnePlus. Like that's the Americanized version. They are famous for having the most locked down bootloader of any Android phone. You cannot root that phone, and you cannot unlock the bootloader for that phone. And therefore, I cannot put anything on that phone that with any level of certainty or trust. And that has meant that it's this beautiful paperweight that's just been sitting on a table, where I've learned more about Android bootloader unlocking than I ever would have, just because I'm like staring at this beautiful thing going, how do I use you? And I ended up just buying the Google equivalent of it to do work on, which is incredibly sad, but it shows you some of the logic there. I was not unwilling to use it because it's Chinese. Like at that point, we're splitting hairs between it was built in China or it was built in Taiwan, right? Like the difference is, it's a hair's breadth away. But what we're saying is like, I cannot inspect this device in its substrate, and therefore I do not trust this thing. And this is a problem that, like,
you can't inspect the competitor that you would be moving to either. So this inspection doesn't exist whatsoever. We've talked about this with the edge device problems as well.
I just think like the focusing much more on like the verifiability element of this, focusing much more like if the US folks wanted to be smarter about this, we would get just realistic about the fact that like we are not going to start manufacturing $30 routers to compete with TP-Link. But what about like focusing on like the open source implementation of like whatever Ubiquity or whatever it is that you go, yes, but in order for you to operate in the US, you have to have an unlocked piece of hardware that can be flashed or will be flashed with this open source standard that we maintain for network gear, which is, it would start to cover some of the issue with Ivanti and Fortinet and these other folks as well, right? Like it would start to cover the issue about things being quote unquote end of life, which I would argue that any piece of hardware you buy for $30 from the Chinese is an end of life product from the day you bought it. Like what fucking updates are you talking about?
It seems to me it's also really important here to make a distinction that in your endpoint with your folding phone comparison may get lost for some people. A distinction between endpoints that are extremely interesting as a collection target, obviously, and something that is ultimately part of network gear on the somewhere in the middle, and in this case in homes mostly. So we distrust midpoints almost as a matter of principle in many applications, not all of them. Obviously, it's more complex, but I think it's important to appreciate for a moment that we shouldn't overstate how valuable access to these retail residential routers really is from a collection point of view. Of course, that is ignoring the question of bricking them at scale in the case of some form of extreme emergency. That, of course, is a whole different conversation, but we should treat it as a different conversation.
I mean, how about internal DDoS, right? Like I've complained ad nauseum about NSA's inability just from an authority standpoint, right? Like the behemoth with the greatest powers in the history of mankind on the internet happens to belong to the United States and be playing on part of Team America. It has zero authority to function within the US whatsoever. And like the reason we're talking about Soho routers and like these like orb networks and they matter is they are a measure of like Chinese craftiness against our own bureaucratic self-limiting. And the whole point of that being, Thomas, you brought up the possibility of them like bricking them en masse just to like sow chaos. What happens if instead of bricking them en masse, they start using them to just like have these massive botnets take down the internet across the United States? And you're talking about hardware and stuff and routes that are being managed within the US. So clearly, like, I mean, the FBI is not going to fucking fix it. If anyone maybe stood a chance, it's NSA. NSA is not allowed to play ball here. So once again, we fall down the rungs of like this national security crisis being entirely in the hands of like the good Samaritans and the woo-woo researchers and the folks who work at the ISPs having the goodwill and self-interest to try to fix some of these problems. But I think that really, just to close that point and like bring it back to the notion of like what happens with the administration and what folks can do, I think the whole point is the government needs to be helping where the private sector cannot. And the regulation might be a dirty word, but I think that in this case, it's more like asking for a form of like consumer protection and even enterprise consumer protection of saying you should not be able to pepper the entire internet with garbage hardware that by definition will never be updated, will be a source of national vulnerability for everybody. And not even like, look, I own the thing. And I do not have control over its management and stability. And that should be anathema to American consumers. And that is where I want to see the administration come in and say, hey, you want to bring your shit like dumping, like manufacturing products into America at prices that mean we will never create them ourselves? Fine, but it has to meet the standard and be compatible with this software stack and allow people to homebrew their way to stability. And that way it can just be a savvy consumer problem.
And absolutely. And that is a much more sophisticated and clever approach than simply saying, oh, don't trust this thing because it's China and therefore could be exploited and become very dangerous to us. It's like imagine Medoc making that argument just before NotPetya. It just makes little sense.
Right.
Does TP-Link get banned eventually? This seems like all this reporting and this slow drumbeat. We've been through it. Like I mentioned, they're getting the Kaspersky treatment. I can see all the parallels slowly building up to, at some point, them getting kicked out of the country. Do you think there's an inevitability?
Does it matter? Does it make any difference at all?
Like it must matter if they have commerce investigations going and we're looking at predatory pricing. There is a serious. You just described all this serious risk.
Okay, but here's the thing, right? Like TP-Link right now is trying to like whitewash itself and like Americanize itself. And you know the CEO is going to drive an Escalade. He's going to marry like a Vegas stripper and like try to just become the most American possible. But
Thomas, this is what the CEO publicly said, by the way.
Like
But
he's like thinking about an Escalade for long road trip. Like he is stuffing his face with apple pie and hot dogs. He's gained 60 pounds. He's like just trying to Americanize his shit.
Yeah.
Won't stop eating mayo and cheese on everything. But like let's say that strategy somehow does not pay off, right? Let's game this out. The strategy doesn't pay off. Nobody buys the Escalade gimmick, and they ban TP-Link. Okay. TP-Link was willing to do all that bullshit just to ingratiate itself. Now it's actually banned. It still has a giant manufacturing base, a ton of surplus product, and it cannot afford or should not allow itself to be banned from the world's biggest consumer. So they start to rebrand them as TP-Link, and they start putting them on Amazon for $15, which is what already happens with all of this Chinese dumping. You seldom buy the Xinhua fucking webcam. You buy the whatever branded Amazon Basics webcam, and it's still manufactured by the same Chinese company. So look, I'm saying that there's an element of futility here to trying to fight this in the whack-a-mole fashion of saying that's a good brand, that's a bad brand. They're all coming from the same place. And frankly, I just don't think that national security should be contingent on goodwill. It shouldn't be a matter of, well, we trust this one company and we don't trust the other one. It is a matter of inspectability. It's even from a high-end enterprise perspective. If I am a savvy, sophisticated company and I refuse to get fucked with these like appliance O-days, I have a team of reverse engineers. I have a team of detection engineers. We have developers. We are going to solve this problem. Like the level of investment it takes to just be able to let's move, like the enterprise is not using a TP-Link router, but they're using a Fortinet router, which to me is not that fucking different. They look awful similar. And you literally need to employ binary level experts to reverse engineer this thing, try to suss the firmware out of it, try to suss you've obviously violated all the EULA. You violated probably the contract under which you bought the thing. You definitely have lost your warranty in doing this thing. And then not only do you have to RE it just to be reverse it just to be able to get some access, then you're talking about whatever development it's going to take to develop
mitigate or
software,
fix anything you fix it.
mitigate, fix, etc. And in what may very well be a hostile platform that you actually cannot consistently load something into. So I think the problem is a consumer protection problem about inspectability. And I would love for us to tackle that problem at the TP-Link level, because that's the only way you're going to tackle that problem at the iPhone level and at the fucking network appliance level, which is to say this is a standard that we need across the board. If Americans are buying this shit, then they should have the ability to maintain it and to keep themselves safe. And we have seen open source standards come up that are really great. Like, all the stuff that your PF senses and all this ubiquity stuff and all this great, I wish Kosin were here. There used to be what was that networking open source thing you would deploy on these old TP-Link and Linksys routers and whatever? There was an open source. It may very well be pfSense. I don't know. But essentially, you will see a community of interested open source folks popping in and providing development and providing these things for a platform that is friendly. The way that you see it with Android, you see Graphene and these other things because you have quality hardware that is designed to be controlled and engineered and inspected by capable people while still being friendly to the average consumer. And
that sounds like a naive ask, though, because I ask, who's going to do this? And I bring this up because of the CISA conundrum we're facing right now. CISA unfunding with CVE, NIST, NVD. The Secure by Design pledge is kind of hanging by a string. All the people who kind of created it. No, the people who created it and evangelized it and went around publicly, they all left CISA already and are off building their careers. right?
But your core argument there is just to make sure that we get it right, is let's create an inspectability standard for this Chinese or China linked product.
All network, internet facing network.
That we can then apply to ourselves.
All products. I mean, because really the problem is universal right now. Like we're, making it the Chinese might be like the boogeyman of today, but it's the same thing that we were just talking about with like the cloud having lowered our defenses as far as like what we're willing to put out on the internet or give to a third party company, and then AI somehow being the thing that, almost 10 years after the fact makes us have a reckoning about whether we should be providing all of our deepest thoughts and intellectual property and secrets to a competitor, to an external company. You're getting the equivalent discussion now where it's like, well, I rely, like getting access to whatever the networking gear is at a company, as proven by Salt Typhoon, is an amazing get because they're entirely not inspectable. They also are a traffic juncture for most of what's going on in that network. So not only do you have an amazing beachhead to be able to come in and out of that network whenever you want, but you can even just sit at that beachhead and collect the traffic like a SIGINT agency and not even need to go into these other endpoints. But if you want to go to the other endpoints, you're very likely get creds, get an understanding of the network. Like it's such a golden spot to sit at. The issue you get is that companies have the same as you see with Apple and the iPhone. Like there is no incentive whatsoever to make the platform itself inspectable, which to me is also goes hand in hand with making it maintainable in a way that is not dependent on the manufacturer. And like this is where, look, a less naive version of my argument is Dan Gear 2015 Black Hat keynote. Phenomenal keynote, one of my favorite talks. He starts talking about like what it's going to take to have software liability. And part of the argument is that it should go hand in hand with like sort of an inverse relationship with intellectual property, right? You say that you own the software stack, you own this thing. Well, that comes with the responsibility to maintain it and provide updates for it, et cetera. And the day that you abnegate that responsibility by saying, well, this is an end-of-life product, you should also abnegate your intellectual property rights to the software and hardware, or like at least the software, so that people can then, the market, the omnipotent market can somehow produce somebody who, maybe a bunch of students decide that they're going to create out-of-band patching for Fortinet devices that have been left end of life. Maybe, you get a consultancy in Germany that decides that they're going to make patches for Windows XP devices for people who still run them in OT environments. And they can do that because it's open source. They can do it because the system is not actively fighting against somebody coming in and defending it out of their own volition. And that's the part where we have this weird incompatibility where you go, oh, I'm no longer taking care of this shit. And you go, well, can I do it? And they go, no, it's our intellectual property. And you go, well, what the fuck, man? So like you're telling me that it's garbage now. Like there is a missing piece there of, of responsible stewardship being emphasized.
I mean, I think in some cases it went or can go even beyond that in terms of you're not just you're even disincentivizing third-party investigators, investigative people from looking at your proprietary product because they.
I think that's why Juan consistently brings up binary, which is this, and that's what we're doing. We're relying on startups to try to build this kind of inspectability software and provide this capability to enterprises that doesn't really exist. I want to flag just in keeping with this, two things that are also on our list to talk about today. Is the Verizon DBIR came out this week, right ahead of RSA, which is pretty solid barometer of how people are actually breaking in. They're actually using raw forensics data from Mandiant and some other places. But they actually flagged very, very significantly here that the security posture of this perimeter gear, barely half of the 0 days exploited last year in these attacks against Fortinet, Sonic Wall, all the Ivantis that we've been talking about forever. Barely half has been fully patched, and it took a median of 32 days to get there. So even forget the inspectability, forget all the other stuff. We're not even mitigating the risk. And for 0 days that are publicly documented. CISA issues warnings. All the stories are out there, and barely half of them remain patched. Pretty interesting data from Verizon DBR right alongside of the Mandiant M-Trends report, which also flagged as the most frequently exploited vulnerabilities this Palo Alto thing, Ivanti, Forti client, and so on. So we have bigger problems beyond not having inspectability as well. We have bigger problems around like enterprises' just ability to mitigate it in time. Is this something that worries you?
Probably ability, even just to see compromises, is also quite significant, and especially as you move away from edge devices into core, in the telco context, core devices. I mean, even less ability to inspect and to patch, because the costs of doing so, potentially service interruptions, are so high, I would think.
I think that's part of the issue. Once again, kind of throwing the onus right back on the manufacturers, your like Fortinets, your Ivantis, and so on. There is an archaic approach to patching with these machines, right? Like genuinely archaic. In some cases, it's not even like there's definitely nothing automated about it, right? You're hoping that somebody, if there is a patch me button, you're lucky. And that still implies that somebody's logging into their firewall, their router, their VPN appliance every once in a while, proactively, just to be like, oh, I wonder if there's an update. And
yeah, but if you're a security team, Juan, like if you're a security team and ODAs are abound and you're a target and Salt Typhoon is circling around, you can't sit back and say we have no way to patch. Like there has to be an emphasis on patching these things. You can't leave 50% of these things unpatched months and months after.
I mean, you can, apparently,
according
to the DBIR, you can and you do. But also, like, look, security, throwing it back to the end customer,
blaming the
I think
victim.
it's giving a pass to these companies. If you're telling me that the update process is completely automated, it lets, and not only that, but like, because routers and VPN appliances are something you seldom log into, there's even a fucking app on my phone that lets me know that as a sysadmin, I just need to schedule what time we will have literally 5 minutes of downtime just so that the appliance can be patched. And that's the only choice I have to make. I just go on my phone and press 2 buttons. Then I can look at the enterprise consumer and go, guys, what the fuck? It's as easy as it could possibly be for you to like go on an app and schedule it. But that is not the situation. But it's not just hard. It literally, in some cases, it literally is entirely contingent on some security, like omniscient security champion who is going to log into, you're assuming there's one appliance of one type, but who's going to log into 17 appliances across the corporate network. And they don't even have a notification that tells you there's new software. You have to go figure out what the model is, go on the website, check if that model in that moment happens to have had a security update nobody fucking told you about. Go download it and like put it in.
Isn't that what your vulnerability patch management software does? Like, I mean, I'm trying to understand, why are we giving these people a pass for not patching these things? You're saying it's really, really difficult and impossible. And I'm saying, well, this is what you invest in. Like, if you could not solve all this risk.
I'm not saying it's difficult and impossible. I'm saying that I think responsibility has to go in sort of like a waterfall model. And right now, in my book, most of the responsibility is on the manufacturers. And the fact that that's the case across the entire product offering, like across the board, from Cisco, like from the mighty Cisco all the way to, the bullshit Fortinet, it means that onus of responsibility is now also falling on the government, as far as I'm concerned, because clearly the market alone isn't going to do it.
I had, for a research project, recently had a bunch of interaction with people who run some, core carrier grade routing infrastructure. And we all know it in the abstract, but it's quite something to have somebody sit in front of you, who points at a machine and says, you have to understand, if this router goes down, about half the population will lose their cell phone connectivity. And then you think for a moment, and he looks at you and says, and I don't mean, and I mean the world's population, because there are, networks that are so important for connecting the pipes between telcos that the load that they carry in terms of just sheer volumes, just like hard to grasp. If you run a machine like that, and that individual described to me how they were just taking one of those machines offline, even just taking it offline in order to be able to dump it, to do a memory dump, that even was a nerve-wracking experience, like to pull the fibers out one by one out of the line cards and to see if the other core routers would catch the load in real time and without service interruption at a potentially global scale. I think it's just hard to appreciate. Now, obviously that's an extreme scenario, but for us, or many of us who maybe work with some network equipment, but usually often deal with endpoints that are obviously important to us and clients, but that scale of service maintenance of offering service to that many people, it gave me some respect for how hard it is to mess with reliability.
You have to have a lot of respect for the network side of the house, right? And like you get like folks like Nimrod at AT&T, or you're like, you talk to them and the complexities of networking at that scale are just fascinating. And like, it's really hard to predict how things are going to play with each other, and like how some of these issues are like even saying, it's not just that there's an outage, but like restoring everything, let's say at the same time, might cause a cascading collapse, or might not be able to provision things all at once, but you can do it in a rolling basis. Like, it's a fairly like networking is where that true genius is in some of this, some of these practical complexities. And it's the equivalent of like what we see with like the OT side of the house, right? Like that one Windows XP machine that if it goes down, half of the East Coast loses electricity. And you start to talk about these systems based on like these cascading dependencies that are very hard to track. But look, man, like those places are where it makes sense from a dollar's perspective to have people on staff all the time who are specialists in these things. The problem we have is not at that level. Like, it's still ridiculous, but you at least have a requirement of like, it's a business survival and viability thing to need to have people on staff that can handle these problems out of band and beyond what can be expected of a normal consumer. The problem is not there. The problem is below that. It's the same as threat intel, right? Like it's a very different conversation to talk about like the top, Fortune 10 that have insane threat intel teams and can afford all kinds of telemetry or whatever it is to do security. That's a different conversation always than the rest of companies, and much less than the consumer side of the house. And that's the discussions we keep having right now are trying to place the same onus and responsibility on that we would on that top tier of well-resourced defenders and sort of like self-managers, all the way down to the consumer grade and like at your house with your TP-Link $30 router. And that's just ridiculous.
And then the alternative to that is we get the FBI seeking tips about the Salt Typhoon infections. The FBI put out a report asking the public to report information about PRC affiliated attack publicly tracked as Salt Typhoon. This is just PRing, Juan? Do people respond to these tips things and help me?
I think it makes us look so small. Like, I think it's the saddest thing on earth for the government for any part of the government is, even if it's the FBI, to come out and like hat in hand and be like, yo, if anybody knows anything about these guys,
10 million
please
reward.
Let us know. A, fucking ridiculous. B, it's also really funny to hear about rewards for justice. Until we hear about someone actually getting a payout from rewards for justice, it's a fucking US government scam as far as I can tell. Just telling people like, yeah, we'll give you some money, and then you come in and you're like, here's a critical tip for that will actually lead to arresting this person. And you go, and they go, oh, this is awesome. And you go, okay, so how much am I getting? And they go, oh, nothing. You go, what the fuck, right? Like it's hard to take it seriously, right? Like if the researchers at Lumen call in rewards for justice and go, yeah, actually, I know a shit ton about Salt Typhoon. Here's everything about their operations. How much are we getting? I think
Didn't the Chinese just admit to this anyway?
it's also really funny to have to do, like, this isn't a crimeware attack. This isn't a DDoS group out of like Sudan. This is a fucking nation state level operation against the, like, at the time, president-elect of the United States. And you're walking out hand in hand being like, yo, does anyone know anything? Like, this looks fucking small.
It might just be part of the playbook, though. Like, you go through a list of these things at the FBI, and at some point you say, okay, we need to put out the rewards, and someone put out the rewards. It's not like they're realistically looking for input, right? Sorry, Thomas, go ahead.
No, I mean, why would they put it out if they're not hoping that it may actually yield something? I would think they're serious. But also, I would add, presumably, if you do this publicly, it doesn't just make you look small, it also makes you look somewhat weak. Because you're effectively signaling to the adversary here that you're trying to incentivize financially motivated defection. I don't believe there's a clear-cut precedent here for the FBI succeeding with a public funding call of this sort, shall we say. And in fact, it's probably broadcasting to the MSS and PLA and, the Chinese intelligence establishment to really up their deterrence and their game in terms of disincentivizing people from doing so, because it's a precedent that would be set.
It's playing a really sad version of the Chinese playbook, right? Like the same way that, like, how much Chinese espionage has the FBI been investigating, which is literally like, oh, we gave somebody like some nice handbags, $10,000 from time to time, took into some hookers, and we got all this like great intellectual property leaked. And like our version of that is like, guys, give us some tips on a nation state level threat at like, again, an operation that victimized that targeted the president-elect, now president, and we're gonna maybe give you $10 million out of like government coffers that, as I keep saying, has yet to actually prove itself out in any meaningful way. It's ridiculous.
I mean, look at it from CIA's perspective. Are we broadcasting something here that maybe should be done covertly instead? And are we broadcasting it's not happening covertly? I don't know the answer to that question, but the looks are a bit funny.
Honestly, this is FBI doing some CIA work, right? Like it's just, what the fuck is this?
I mean, doesn't this, if there's a Salt Typhoon investigation, isn't there like a cross agency collaboration that makes sure everyone is in sync with what we're putting out, how we're signaling, what we're expected out of the signaling? Or am I assuming competence where it doesn't exist? Help me understand how these things work.
You think there's like a cross-agency deconfliction and collaboration and efforts across the U.S. government?
The way Salt Typhoon is being positioned as this kind of wartime China all up in our networks doing whatever they please, and this is the most, severe thing we've dealt with.
You think that because it's important, the U.S. government is going to get out of its own way and coordinate? I'd like to live in that world. I'd like to.
Thomas, give me the less cynical. Give me the less cynical take. Let's close the show.
I'm not sure what this. It's too much speculation involved here, but I would be also cynical in the sense that maybe there's not as much coordination here as one would hope from the outside. I would not be surprised.
Does this suggest that an FBI investigation is progressing, or does this suggest that an FBI investigation is stalled?
I mean, you're kind of answering your own question here, aren't you?
I think so.
It's also fucking ridiculous that this is an FBI like investigation. I'm not arguing, like, especially in this particular day and age, I'm not saying that like I'm not highlighting the value of like domestic intelligence, but I also just cannot look at the FBI as like the source of competency in the United States for an attack of this level, right? Like that's not even getting, like, you're not even getting the right athletes on the field for something like this.
Right.
And, it's just sad. The whole thing is so sad.
All right. On that note, let's close the show with some shout outs. Thomas, anybody you want to give some shout outs to? Anything to plug? What's happening in your world?
I mean, I just want to give you a shout out, Ryan, for the podcast here, because you shared in the prep notes, you shared this story about this podcast phishing scheme. And I read the sentence: if the victim takes the podcast appearance bait, the hackers schedule a call over Zoom to learn more about the victim's work, sometimes withholding meeting details until the very last minute in order to induce additional urgency. Well, that is exactly how we organized this podcast. I was very concerned when I read that.
That's how the podcast is run. And by the way, that's a significant story. That was North Korean Lazarus folks actually abusing this remote control feature in Zoom to and some really interesting phishing lures around using podcasts. Thomas, thank you very much at last minute notice with no preparation whatsoever, hopping on with us today. My shout out is to Costin. I hope his dental surgery went well and he'll be back next week with some philosophizing on the nature of the universe and whatever new quantum crypto comes up. Juanito, you get the last word. What are your shout outs?
Wow. Okay. Well, actually, I do have quite a few this time around. So as I'd mentioned, Max Smeets, great to see him out here. If you haven't watched his keynote for LabsCon, the trust paradox was actually fascinating and a really great precursor to talking about his new book. So go check that out for sure. And also just thinking about last night, Thomas, thank you so much for being such a good sport. This is literally less than 24-hour notice for you to jump on here. And it just, for those of you not in DC, you are the opposite version of the bullshit conversations that are happening in San Francisco, I think are happening over here in DC in this small group of you'd be surprised how many security folks are willing to spend literally a Friday night or a Saturday night, my place, at Thomas's place, wherever, just discussing some of these more important philosophical implications of AI. And that gives me a lot of heart, and I hope that we can start to formalize that, away from the AI sommelier society to some publications and some discussions that sort of rival and give more of a counterweight to the bullshit that's being so casually peddled in San Francisco. So to you, Thomas, and Martin Wendigenson, who's in the middle of moving, Mike Hom, who's in the middle of recovering, Joel, who's in the middle of general crisis, Alex, etc., some of these other folks. And the last thing, I think, hopefully more relatably, forget RSA, but really excited for Dave Itel's event next week. There's an OpenAI security offshoot that I'm really looking forward to. So I'm hoping to hear some of these things more resonated, or hopefully just see a forum from OpenAI on having these discussions. I would love that. Last bit, since I'm already ranting shout outs, the fucking LabsCon CFP is finally here. A lot of folks ask throughout the year. Now is the time. You've got about a month. So, labscon.io, give us your fine research. Thomas is part of the CFP committee here, so maybe bribe Thomas, Kostin, and some of these folks. But as always, competition, I expect the competition to be extremely fierce. We're also right now open for sponsors, which is always an interesting conversation to have with folks. To be honest, this is, I think, a very interesting measure of what kind of contributions you're looking to make to the community, right? For the companies that are sponsoring RSA and all these other boondoggles, I get that you're trying to get some leads. It's very different to actually sponsor a venue that respects its speakers and its attendees, and that is more about that contribution directly to the community. So for folks that are interested in that, we absolutely would love to hear from you right now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Juanito. You're heading to RSA. I'll see you out in San Francisco next week.
You'll see me if you're there for the Dave Itel thing. I'm not going to that fucking RSA boondoggle.
Thomas, again, thank you so very much for filling in for Costin. It was a thrill for me. I'd love to have you back whenever you're available. Just say the word.
Thank you.
Dude, drop the next book already.
Oh, man. Let me write first.
Love that.